Although being firmly in the middle class, we had everything we required and were happy with our lives. The most supportive in my life were my parents. Both of them were beautiful in their own particular ways, and my mother always smelled of fresh flowers and had long, curly hair that she maintained in a ponytail. She consistently put the needs of others ahead of her own. She enjoyed reading and was always willing to assist me with my homework. My father had a powerful voice and was a tall man, so when he spoke, everybody listened. He always looked dapper and it was obvious that he was confident in whatever he did. He enjoyed playing basketball with me and on the weekends he would take me to the park. I had a wonderful relationship with my parents. They were always available to hear about my issues and to help me get through difficult times. They pushed me to pursue my passions and follow my ambitions, and they both put in a lot of overtime. But they still found time for me and were constantly there in my life. My father's business wasn't doing so well once, as I recall, and for all of us, it was a difficult time. We had to give up some of the minor comforts we used to enjoy since money was so tight. Now, even though my parents always made an effort to provide for my needs, I could sense that they were having difficulty. I recall my mother reselling her jewelry to support my father's company. I was aware of how much it meant to her, but she never voiced any complaints or made a big deal out of it. My father put in a lot of effort and stayed up late working to support our family. He never showed us how anxious he was, but I could tell my father once came to us with a novel business concept as he spoke about his new endeavor, and that might be extremely successful. Enthusiasm lit up in his eyes. Although my father had always been a diligent businessman lately, things have been difficult. We were straining to make ends meet because money was scarce, and my mother and father spent numerous hours going over every aspect of the plan. He even persuaded her to put our family's savings into it. Well, my mother's trepidation was evident in her eyes, but my father's joy was absolutely contagious. He assured us that it would work and this might be the solution to all our problems and that our dreams might actually come true. Well, initially reluctant, my mother was eventually persuaded by my father's unflinching confidence in his new NDERs. My mom invested in it by selling her jewelry, and my father contributed all of his savings. They knew it was a risk, but they were prepared to accept it. My father arrived home shortly after with the biggest smile upon his face. He gathered us into the living room and revealed the success of his business enterprise. We would well become wealthy soon. My mother's eyes were beaming with happiness and I could not believe it. That was like waking up from a dream. Father took us out to my favorite restaurant to celebrate. We had the biggest, most delicious meal. And we talked excitedly about all the new things we would buy and the places we would visit. After dinner, Father drove us around the neighborhoods of the rich and affluent. He told us we would be moving into a big house with a backyard and a pool. I couldn't believe that we were finally going to have all these things that we've dreamt of for so long. It seemed that my life changed so much after we moved to the neighborhood. I went to a prestigious new school, had new friends and all the branded clothes I wanted. We could afford to go on vacations and enjoy a little luxuries of life that seemed unaffordable just months ago. Well, I soon noticed that my father was not as round as much as he was before. He would come home late or sometimes not at all. And when he was home, he was always on the phone or in his studies. My mother became increasingly lonely and sad, and I could see the sadness building up amongst her eyes. I missed the old days when my father would come home early, play games with me, or take me out for a little treat. I missed the family dinners where we would sit together and talk about our day. Now it seemed like we were just all living in our own world and nobody had time for each other. Then one day, I was playing video games in my room when I heard a doorbell ring. I rushed to the door to see who it was, and I saw a woman standing right there. She was tall with the long blonde hair that cascaded down her back in loose waves. She had a slim figure and wore a tight-fitted dress that showed off her curves. Her face, it was angular with sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes. She said her name was Alicia and she was my father's new secretary. Oh, my mother appeared from the kitchen and greeted Alicia with a forced smile. "Hello, Alicia. What brings you here?" My mother asked. Alicia smirked and tossed her hair over her shoulders. I'm here to pick up some clothes from Mr. Johnson. He's working late at the office tonight, and he didn't have time to come home and change. My mother. Smile turned sour, and I could tell she was very uncomfortable at this moment. I didn't blame her. Alicia seemed like the type of woman who enjoyed making others feel inferior. I watched as my mother handed over a bag of clothing and saw the way Alicia's eyes lingered on my mother's wedding ring, and I didn't like it one bit. As days passed, Alicia's visits to her house became frequent and suspicious. One day my mother decided that we should surprise my father at his favorite lunch at the office. We took the elevator to his floor and as we approached the office, we heard muffled noises coming from inside. My mother pushed open the door and there was my father kissing Alyssa. Mother gazed, and I felt rage bubbles inside of me. How could he do this to us? My father looked up in shock and tried to explain, but my mother ran out of the office before he could even get the words out. I stood there feeling numb and angry at the same time. I glared at Alicia, who had a smug look upon her face, and left the office. As we drove back home, my mother was silent, tears streaming down her face, and I placed my hand on hers and she looked at me, her eyes filled with sadness. "I never thought this would happen to us," she said with her voice breaking. Well, I didn't know what to say, but I knew I had to try to console her. So I say, we'll get through this, Ma. I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We're strong. We'll figure it out together. She smiled, cracked weakly at me, and I could see the appreciation in her eyes. Thank you, my love, she said while squeezing my hand. I know you'll always be there for me. I nodded, not knowing what else to say, and we drove the rest of the way home in silence. But I knew that I needed to be there for my mother for more now than ever. So I was dreading what would happen when my father got home. How he would react if he would fight with my mother, or acted as if nothing happened. He came home late after we already had dinner. I sat on the couch watching television when I heard my parents arguing in the other room. Their voices rose and I covered my ears with my hands. I wanted to go be with my mother to stand with her and support her, but I could not bring myself to do it. A minute later, my mother stormed into the room and sat down next to me. She looked sad and tried to envelop me in her arms. After some time, my father came into the living room with a serious expression on his face. He sat down on the chair straight across from me and handed a piece of paper to my mother. Ah, here are the divorce papers. I'm marrying Alicia. I'm done with this family. I've grown tired of you, my father said as his voice devoured of any emotion. My mother's eyes widened. She started crying quietly, looking at my father in disbelief. But why? We love each other. What about all the sacrifices I've made for you and this family? Oh, that was a long time ago. You've reaped all the benefits of my success too, but a lot's changed and I think it's for the best. I think it's best for everyone. I felt a mix of emotions, anger and sadness filling me up. I could not believe my father would treat my mother this way after all she had done for him. I'm going with Mom, I said with my voice shaking with emotion. Oh, don't be foolish. Stay here with me. But I wasn't going to change my mind. My mother stood up and wiped her tears and said, okay, we'll leave. We don't want to stay here anyways, where we're not wanted, she said, taking my hand and leaving towards the door. As we walked out of the house, I could not help but feel a sense of betrayal. My father, who had always been there for us, was not willing to throw everything away just for a woman he barely knew. But at the same time, I was glad that my mother and I were leaving. We did not need him or his money. We had each other, and that was enough. Soon enough, we moved back to a small place near our original house, and I returned to the same school. I thought that even without my fear, we would still be happy there, but I could not have been more wrong. Nothing was the same as before. All the streets I used to travel, the rows, I used to wander, looking wrong and fake. Now I hated it there, but I tried to stick it out for my mom. Mom and father soon divorced and she was granted custody of me. Father was required to pay child support to her, and it wasn't much, but we got by. I was slowly starting to adjust to my life there when life threw another curveball right at my face. My mother, she gets very sick. All of a sudden it starts with a cold, which we thought would go away soon enough. But the weeks passed and her cough, it grew worse. She lost a lot of weight and started coughing up blood. When we finally went to the hospital, the doctor there told us it was stage 4 lung cancer, rapidly progressive, and almost always fatal. My world came crashing down around me the second time in just a few months, and I wanted my mother to tell my father about her condition. The least he could do after treating her so cruelly was helping out with medical bills, but she insisted of him not knowing after a tough, but thankfully short time later. Mother passed in her sleep still underage and with no means to support myself. I was forced to call my father. He was shocked to hear of my mother's death and told me to come back home. Grief-stricken and indifferent, I agreed. Update 1. When I went back to my father's house, I was met with another surprise, a stepbrother. He had moved in when Alicia had married my father. Just a few short weeks after the divorce with Ma, my father encouraged me to spend time with Jack, Alicia's son. Jack was a 14-year-old boy with a nasty demeanor. He had a stocky build, short black hair and a permanent scowl on his face. His short black hair was cut short and he had a scowl that never left his face. His large clothing, which he tried to pass off as a fashion sense, but actually it just made him look like a gangster. It's something that he wore all the time. Jack was a bully who enjoyed harassing other people, particularly those who were less strong than him, and he liked to make people feel small by shoving them around. He adopted his mother's habits and he had mastered the art of using anger to obtain what he desired. Nobody at school liked and most people tried to avoid him if possible. Those kids who did tolerate him did so because of my father's money. I had no interest in getting to know him, but around father, he was always fawning over me trying to be friendly. I knew he was doing that to get into father's good graces. I mostly just ignored him and stayed up in my room when father wasn't there. He acted so totally different. He would just tease me, making fun of me, front of his buddies, and was quite cruel to me. I was always the odd one out in the group, and I knew my stepmother supported this attitude. That household was an absolute nightmare to live in. I often felt like an outsider in my own home because of Alicia's chilly and cunning behavior. She would be continuously playing mind games with me. My father's attention was also absorbed by his new family, that he was oblivious to what was taking place in front of them. Even though I knew I had to leave, I had nowhere else to go. The only friend I still had in the house was Reynolds, my father's driver. He had been with father since his early days in the business world, and my father had kept him on after he had gotten rich and successful, and he'd always cared deeply for him and well treated me like his own son. He knew life at my father's house was hard for me and he tried his best just to be there for me, but it wasn't enough. Life at the manor grew more and more suffocating for me every single day. The casual times, the insults and the indifferent cruelty were beginning to take a part on my mental health. I finally reached my breaking point one day. I finally lost it because Jack and his friends were picking on me once more. I defend myself though, which led to a violent altercation with my stepbrother. In the midst of it, my father returns home and because of his rage, he orders me to leave the house now. I was inconsolable and I had no idea where to go or who to contact. I wound up spending a few months surviving on the streets. I promised myself at the time that I would one day exact my revenge on Alicia and Jack for what they've done to me. Update number 2. Wow. After I was kicked out of my father's house, I was lost and alone. I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I thought about contacting Reynolds, but then thought about what my father would do to me if he found out that he was in contact with me. I decided it was best that I stay away from him altogether. So I wandered the streets, sleeping in alleys and scrounging for food wherever I could find it. Life on the streets was tough, and I quickly learned that I had to be tough to survive. I did whatever I could just to get by. I begged for spare, changed wash car windows, and even did odd jobs for people. It wasn't enough to live comfortably, but it was enough to keep me alive. I learned to be resourceful and never gave up hope that things would get better. So one day I was attempting to remain warm while sitting outside of the coffee shop. When a woman approached me, she appeared to have just left work because she was wearing a business suit. In front of me, she came to a stop and gave me a business card. You were sitting here and I couldn't help but notice you. I work for a foster care agency and I believe we could be of assistance to you. Call me if you're interested. I was initially dubious, but I made the decision to try it. When I phoned the number on the card, I was put in touch with Sarah. She questioned me briefly before informing me that they had a family who was ready to help. I was picked up the following day by Tom and Linda, an absolute pleasant couple. They lived in a sizable, comfortable house in the suburbs and were both retired for the minutes I arrived. They embraced me with open arms and made me feel like a member of their family. Living with Tom and Linda was a completely different experience than living with my father and stepmother. They were considerate, understanding, and patient. They did not criticize me for my history or my present circumstances, and provided me with the encouragement I absolutely needed. I started going to school again. Quickly, well caught up on what I've missed. Tom and Linda helped me with my homework as well and encouraged me to do well in my classes. It was during this time that I realized I wanted to become a doctor. I wanted to help people who were going through hard times and make a positive difference in the world. Now that I was in a secure place, I would just take the risk of calling Reynolds and re-establishing contact with him. He was delighted to hear from me and was glad that I was safe and happy. Well, with Tom and Linda's help, I was able to get into college and eventually even medical school. It was a long and difficult journey, but I knew that it was worth it, so I was determined to succeed and make a better living for myself. Update number 3. One day while I was in my final year of medical school, Reynolds calls me. He sounded urgent and told me that he had something very important to tell me. He asked me to meet him at a coffee shop near my apartment. When I arrived, Reynolds was sitting at a table and he looked worried. He handed me a folder, told me to read the contents carefully inside the folder, which was my father's will dated years back before he became rich. The will stated that everything he had would be passed to me, including the fortune, his assets, all of it. He explained that my stepmother had been trying to get my father to change the will for years. She had been slowly poisoning him, causing him to get sicker and sicker so that she could manipulate him and deciding everything over to her and her son for a second. I felt a sort of savage pleasure at what he had told me. After how he had treated Mother, I felt he was finally getting what he deserved. And after giving up such a wonderful family and loving wife, he was seeing the consequences of his actions. But the next second, I was plagued with guilt. My mother had always taught me to be a kind and compassionate person, and she would hate me for the resentment towards my father. I knew then I had to step in and help Dad. I asked him to tell me everything and not to leave out a single detail. So Reynolds told me about how Alicia had recently started blackmailing my father's lawyer. She had found out that he was embezzling company money and had threatened to reveal his wrongdoings if he did not help her. In her plan, she wanted him to draw up new papers, detailing that everything is transferred over to her and her son, and she wanted the lawyer to make him sign the papers well by pretending that they had something to do with stocks and such. After the papers were done, she was planning on upping his dosage of drugs that she's been giving him, so he would get sick and sick and sick. She would then divorce him anytime she wanted to get away with all the money, leaving him absolutely penniless. At this point, Reynolds had discovered all of this because of one of the maids at the house who was still loyal to my father, and had overheard Alicia telling her son about her plan. Distraught, she immediately informed Reynolds, and with Reynolds' help, wow, I came up with a plan. I wanted him to keep a close eye on the lawyer and figure out what he drew up on the papers. Meanwhile, I needed to get some things done on my own, so I decided to go back to my father's house. I didn't want him to be alone with those monsters anymore. Update number 4. On the day of my graduation, I went back home. I made sure to coincide my visit with my father getting home, so he had no choice but to see me. His mouth dropped upon when he saw me, and he didn't know what to say. After not having seen me for so long, I hugged him tightly, telling him that I was glad to see him, and after a moment, he hugged me back. I asked him if I could come in. He invites me in. When Alicia saw me step into the house, the expression on her face was priceless. She was absolutely shocked, and her face twisted with anger. However, she didn't say anything in front of Father and pretended she was glad to see me. Father told me to stay for dinner and he and I went to a study to talk. I told him about everything that's been going on in my life and that I was a doctor now. Well, he was very proud of me. Ed was surprised when I told him that I've kept in touch with Reynolds throughout the years. After I was done talking, we were silent for a while. Suddenly, he broke down crying and said, "Oh, I can't believe you're here, Sud, and that I'm seeing you again after so long. I know, Dad, I've missed you so much too. I just couldn't stay away any longer. I feel the same way. Son, I've wronged you as well as your mother. I want to make amends for what I've done. And the first step towards that would be you agreeing to stay here with me." Well, since that's what I secretly wanted anyways, I quickly agreed, but I knew I needed to go a step further. "Dad, you don't look so well. I don't want you to work a lot anymore." "Okay, how about you work from home a bit? I'm sure the guys at the office can handle most affairs without you there." He seemed to consider my suggestion and nodded and said, "Oh, you're right. I feel like I've been neglecting my health. I should take some time off. Besides, you're here now. Well, I should spend as much time with you as possible." I grinned to myself in that case. I'll go see Alicia and Jack. I haven't seen them in a bit. Alicia had been livid when she'd seen me step over the doorstep, but when I went downstairs and announced that I was staying there for some time, oh boy, she got even angrier. "What do you mean you're staying here? This is my house. You're not welcome here." I made a show of looking around and said, "Last time I checked, this was still my father's house. Not yours. Not your idiot son's. If he wants me here, I'm going to stay and there's nothing you can do about it." I paused watching the color drain out of her face, and you know what else. "It's your turn to leave. I'm not a little boy anymore and I'm not scared of what you can do to me. We'll see about that." I settled in at the house, spending all my time with my father, and well, I asked him detailed questions about his health and where he kept his medication. My dad's medication was kept in the dining room atop a cabinet in plain sight to make sure that he remembered to take it regularly. All I had to do was set up a tiny camera and full view of the cabinet, and when he said that his prescription was almost up, I volunteered to go get it filled instead. "Oh, you don't have to," he protested, saying, "Lucia usually does it for me really well. In that case, I'll go tell her. She doesn't have to do it this time." I made sure to inform her that I was going to get Dad's medicine. She looked angry, but of course she didn't say anything. I knew that I would have to keep a close eye on her. She would try to switch out the medication soon. So I got the new prescription and put the pills in the cabinet, and all I had to do was wait, as I expected. That night I saw her creep downstairs and switch the pills. I got the entire thing on tape the next day before my dad could take the pills, secretly switched them out again. That way she could keep thinking he was taking the wrong pills. One part of my plan was complete for the next part. I enlisted Reynolds' help update number 5. A few days later he told me the new will was all drawn up and the lawyer would be calling my dad soon. Considering that my dad was mostly at home now, he had no choice but to bring the papers over. Alicia tried to keep out of the way, but I made sure to stay in the study when the lawyer visits. Reynolds showed the man and he offered him a drink. When the lawyer put the paper in front of my father, Reynolds pretended to trip and spill the drink on the man. He apologized profusely and offered to help him clean up. He ushered a man out of the room, leaving my father and me alone with the papers. "Hey Dad," I said, "I never showed you pictures from my graduation. You want to see them?" "Of course." "Well, I just emailed them to you. Check your phone." I had made sure that his phone was put on a charging on the port across the room. As he got up to check his phone, I opened the files and switched out the papers. When the lawyer entered the room, we were busy looking over at our graduation pictures. He moved toward the file and said, "You should sign these now, sir." Since I was sitting close by, he hurried my father through the process without looking at it, which it contained. As soon as he was done, he got up and said, "Leaving so soon?" I asked with a grin. "I just need to get these signed from Madam and then I'll be leaving." He said with a forced smile, "Oh, don't bother yourself." I said, "Reynolds will call her here." So Reynolds exited the room and re-entered it a few minutes later with Alicia. Unto the success of my plans depended on neither her nor the lawyer looking too closely at the papers. And when she came in, she looked uneasily at the lawyer. He held out the papers and said, "Here, ma'am, you need to sign these." I got up, moving closer to them, and said, "Can I have a look?" Alicia gave a nervous laugh. Then she threw through the papers, signing rapidly. She looked pointedly at the lawyer, who turned up to me. "Oh, maybe some other time, sir. I have to be on my way soon." I held up my hands. "Of course, Reynolds can drive you since you're in a hurry." I had planned for Reynolds to switch out the file again since we needed the papers that Alicia just signed. Well, update number 6. The very next day Reynolds calls to let me know that it was done. My plan was complete. I went to my father and told him everything, and I showed him the video of Alicia switching his pills. He was devastated by this news and immediately went to find her. She tried to deny it at first, saying that I've set her up as revenge for my mother's death, and that she was just making sure that I had not switched the medicine myself since she didn't trust me when I showed her the video. She came clean. Yes, I switched the pills, but it doesn't matter since everything belongs to me. You are so stupid. You just signed over everything to me this morning and you don't even know it. You could contest the paper. Sure, but with what money? Everything belongs to me now. I won't be so sure of that. Reynolds came around the corner, handed me the file. Oh yes, I switched out the papers before you and Dad signed them. She looked at me with horror. What did you make me sign? It states here that you're waiving your right to inherit anything after father dies and waiving your right to get anything. If you two get divorced, she gasped, turning pale. I also have the papers. You tried to get that to sign. I think you should leave now. The new lawyers will be in touch soon, right, Dad? Oh yeah, he said, mopping his forehead. I've finally seen your real face and I'm going to divorce you soon. Now get out of my house. Alicia tried to plead with him, saying that it was all a mistake and she was sorry, but he didn't listen. He kicked her out of the house and a few days later he simultaneously filed for divorce and sued her for trying to poison him with drugs. He won both lawsuits and Alicia went to jail for her crimes after the trial was over. My father begged me for forgiveness and I forgave him instantly. We talked about our plans for the future, and life had given us another chance and we weren't going to waste it. He wanted to spend his remaining years traveling, exploring the world, and I promised to be there with him every step of the way. You know, right when this story started, I had the worst feeling about this stepmother, and the more I kept reading, I finally realized, yeah, this lady's super toxic and very vile. But the fact that she would intentionally get another human sick just so she can benefit when he dies, it's absolutely heart-wrenching and beside the point, just downright evil.